house was not ransacked. It was not forcibly entered. The doors were locked.
A brutal killing.
It was apparent right then and there that we were dealing with something different.
A housewife, a former medical professional. She was involved in her local community.
A very devoted mother of a little boy.
Who had the motive to kill this lady?
A dark mystery with multiple suspects.
You have 4 and 5 different pieces of DNA, all from different people?
The person that claimed that they were a soldier of God, soldier of death.
It was just bizarre.
The truth will be revealed.
I would not know how to classify it other than an assassination.
Every day in North America, dozens of people are murdered. The key to solving the toughest of these homicides lies in the final 24 hours of the victim's life. To crack the case, detectives must reconstruct that critical timeline. The minutes and hours containing evidence that can help unlock the mystery and catch the killer. The sleepy town of Williamsport, Pennsylvania, nestled in a lush valley, surrounded by forest.
Williamsport has a long history, tradition. You go back to the lumber barons, and of course, Little League Baseball started here. It's just a nice place to grow up, and you usually don't fear for your safety.
But one January morning, a grim discovery shatters that serenity.
We received a call from 911 indicating that a woman had been found in her residence. A friend, Dwayne Van Fleet, had gone to try to locate her. He found that the residence was locked. There was no answer at any of the doors. He looked through a window and observed the victim on the kitchen floor. The victim's name was Miriam Illis. It was obvious that she was deceased.
She's killed based on a gunshot to her back in the area of her heart.
It's up to state troopers William Holmes and Scott Henry to find her killer. The first step is questioning the man who made the 911 call.
One of the things you do first off the bat is try to find out about as much about the victim and their life as you can.
Mr. Van Fleet was one that was able to provide a fair amount of information to us.
Miriam Illis was a housewife, a former medical professional. She was involved in her local community, and part of the reason they found her that day was she didn't show up to teach Sunday school.
She was an extremely good person, very devoted mother of a little boy.
She had a certain amount of stature, and a lot of people knew her.
One of the things that I recall with talking to him was she had no enemies. She had no enemies. Everyone got along with her.
Who would have a motive to do this to a middle-aged Sunday school teacher in Pennsylvania?
Investigators need to unlock every detail of Miriam's last 24 hours. But there's one key problem.
In any murder investigation, it becomes important to try to establish the time of death. A lot of times that's established with eyewitnesses. Somebody sees the crime occur. However, in this case, there were no eyewitnesses.
They look to Miriam herself for an approximate time of death.
The body can tell many tales. How long it's been there, rigor mortis, lividity, aid in determining, at least initially, how long this person's been deceased. And these are things that we are trained to look at.
There was some blood on her body. It appeared that she had laid there for a while. In canvassing the area, we couldn't find anybody that had seen her after 5 o'clock Friday evening, the 15th.
Without more information, investigators can only determine a wide window for the murder, placing it sometime late Friday night. They turn to the crime scene, looking for clues about the killer.
The house was not disheveled, it was not ransacked, it was not forcibly entered. The doors were locked. All the exterior doors were locked to the residence, the garage. There was a handset for a telephone within close proximity to her hand.
As detectives subpoena her phone records, they face an uphill battle. A much-loved mother, killed within her locked house. Then, a keen eye spots a critical clue.
We noticed a bullet hole in the window at that time.
It was a double-pane exterior window. It was located directly above the kitchen sink.
It was apparent that the shot had come from the outside.
Our theory at that point was that, she was leaning, standing up against the kitchen sink, talking on the telephone when the round was fired that struck and killed her.
For a gunshot to be fired outside of the residence through a window, striking somebody, killing them, was something that I had not seen before.
This was in a residential neighborhood. There was no hunting season that was in effect. This was clearly not a hunting accident.
I would not know how to classify it as other than an assassination.
Somebody deliberately chose to set up, lie in wait, and assassinate Miriam Illis, sniper style, through her kitchen window.
It was shocking because this woman was murdered in her own home, and it doesn't happen that way.
That single shot is now the only lead.
When the investigators then traced trajectory of the shot back, it took them back to a stream bed in behind Miriam Illis's house.
And then, as we looked a little further, our forensics team was able to find footprints.
They came from a Reebok full-tilt basketball shoe, and that was the tread pattern. Size 14, they were positioned in a way where someone took up a shooting position alongside a tree that was directly back from Miriam's kitchen window. The investigators also found a cigarette butt in the area where the shot had been taken.
As they looked further, they were able to find what turned out to be a homemade silencer.
Very rare, at least in my career, did you find a silencer. It was apparent right then and there that we were dealing with something different.
This establishes how Miriam Illis was shot, but the mystery of who did it and why remains.
For an execution-style killing, you have to have it planned. You have to have it planned in advance. Either the person wanting someone dead has to retain someone to do the crime, or they have to do it themselves and try to cover up their tracks.
Somebody has taken great steps, great pains to plan out and execute this murder. It was not like Miriam was involved in some type of criminal enterprise, or that she was doing some kind of risky behavior where she was putting herself in harm's way. She was at home on a Friday night.
Was she concerned or afraid for her life? What was going on in the last 24? Was she hiding? Did she say anything to anybody? Who saw her come home? These are all factors that become critical to helping you investigate the case.
Some of those questions may soon be answered.
As the investigators were processing the scene, Dr. Richard Illis showed up.
Dr. Richard Illis was a heart surgeon here in the Williamsport hospital. He was well known, and a lot of people called him a lifesaver.
When a woman's murdered in her home, you must look at the husband first. They're the closest to the deceased. They're the ones that ought to be able to give you the most information.
It's difficult to talk with grieving family members about this, but by the same token, they want to know, and they want to help, and therefore they'll do anything they can.
Dr. Illis tells investigators he last saw Miriam when he stopped by the house 2 days earlier, on Friday at 5 p.m.
He was going to visit his family, which was down in the Chester County area of Pennsylvania.
Detectives then learn the couple had recently separated after being married for 8 years.
Miriam Illis had moved out of the family residence. Primary custody of their son, Richie Illis, 5-year-old, was with Miriam Illis, and her husband had visitation time with Richie every other weekend. The fact that they were going through this divorce established a potential motive.
You have to look at, how was their relationship? Were they happy? Were they unhappy? Were there any public instances of, fights? That type of thing. You have to look at all of those variables.
Was it a argument that went bad? Well, not in this case. Not when you have a sniper fire.
Beyond the facts, a seasoned detective would be looking for tells. Everyone has them. Everyone has some sort of give, if you will. Detectives are trained to recognize all of that.
As they probe further, the doctor's behavior seems off.
One of the first things he said, after being told that Miriam was dead, he asked what evidence was found, which the investigators thought was odd.
It seemed kind of a strange question for somebody to ask at that point.
He then makes an interesting admission.
He told us he was no stranger to firearms. He had a hunting background and that he had owned some firearms, which a lot of people in this area do. That's not a big deal. But we wanted to take a look and see what he had and if it related to, the crime scene at all.
We were able to determine that bullet that killed her was a .22, which gave us information on what type of weapon to look for.
And in fact, they did obtain and take from Dr. Illis numerous .22 caliber class rifles.
This puts Miriam's former partner front and center.
Love can very easily turn into hate, and that hate can grow and grow and grow until you can't think about anything else other than that person who you hate being dead.
Dr. Richard Illis has become the first suspect in his wife's murder. While his guns are sent for testing, investigators scrutinize his life.
He did, of course, as a cardiothoracic surgeon, make a very good living financially. He was paying quite a sum of money in child support per month. I believe the total was somewhere in the area of $12,000.
That was the largest support order that had ever been entered in Lycoming County history.
Killing somebody for money is not uncommon. In fact, it's the opposite. You're either killing somebody for money or you're killing somebody for love. Those are the two main reasons anybody ends up dead.
With an age-old motive for murder, investigators press the doctor for details on where he was when Miriam was shot.
Dr. Illis was supposed to pick Richie up for the weekend visitation on Friday evening.
Dr. Illis decided to spend the weekend with his sister, 2.5 hours away in Honeybrook, Pennsylvania. He can substantiate the start of his journey through a witness, Nancy Mitch.
It was a friend of Miriam's that had stopped by to visit, to speak for a few minutes, chit-chatting.
Nancy Mitch was able to explain to investigators that she was with Miriam to be present during the exchange when Miriam transferred their son Richie to Dr. Richard Illis for the weekend.
Dr. Illis was supposed to pick Richie up on Friday evening at 4 o'clock. We had learned from Nancy that he was a little late getting there. He picked up his son at Miriam's residence approximately 5 o'clock, so we knew he left the residence with his son. Nancy had left and Miriam seemed to be okay.
So we could last verify that Miriam was alive around 6 p.m. on Friday, January 15th.
Dr. Illis says he then made a quick pit stop before heading to his sister's.
They'd gone home to his house first.
He had left for southeastern Pennsylvania approximately 9:30 in the evening with his son.
He said they drove to Lewisburg and stopped at a fast food restaurant.
He had indicated that that stop was sometime around 10 p.m. The weather was bad that evening, and he called his sister around 11:24 p.m. and indicated that he was going to stop, and him and Richie were going to spend the night in the Harrisburg area.
Nancy has confirmed one piece of Dr. Illis's alibi. Detectives must now determine if the rest of his information is accurate.
They could verify the cell phone call to his sister on the phone records. And we know that Dr. Illis had checked in at 12:57 a.m. at a hotel in the Harrisburg area. That gives him a clear check-in time, a receipt for when he's there, so he has corroboration for his whereabouts.
Dr. Illis's story seems to hold up, but investigators also check him against the physical evidence.
The center of the silencer had holes that were drilled through it. That was used to affix the silencer to the murder weapon. None of his guns had such a thing. There was nothing that could establish the murder weapon, but it was Dr. Illis's gun. In addition, there was some DNA that was found on hairs inside the silencer. And there was DNA found in a cigarette butt. Ultimately, the DNA that was tested did not match Dr. Richard Illis.
According to the evidence, Dr. Illis was nowhere near the house at the time of the murder. But as they press for more information, he makes another admission.
Dr. Illis was having an affair.
He had developed a romantic relationship with a coworker who he worked with at the Williamsport Hospital. And that may have led in part to the separation.
It seemed like very similar circumstances to how he met Miriam. He started working with her. They developed this relationship and got married. And then it was kind of the same way with Katie. She actually took Miriam's job and then ended up a relationship.
It's one of the oldest crimes in the books, so to speak, is love triangle murders. Perhaps as many as 15 or 20% of the ones I investigated involved a love triangle of some kind.
The other woman, Katie Suarez, potentially would have a motive to kill Miriam. She could have wanted Dr. Illis all for herself and to get Miriam out of the picture to eliminate the chance that Dr. Illis would go back with his wife.
Jealousy is an amazing thing because jealousy often leads to obsession, and obsession is what drives people to commit horrific acts.
But there's more at stake than just their relationship.
Between a potential divorce and the alimony, there was a lot of money involved there. There's a big financial issue. If Miriam left the picture all of a sudden, she would reap the benefits of anything that he would gain.
Detectives must determine where Richard's new girlfriend was when Miriam was killed.
Katie Suarez was somebody that he would have spent a lot of his free time with and that would be around him, but if he was going to travel out of town to visit his family, that would give her the opportunity to commit the crime.
They quickly track Katie down.
We learned that she was definitely out of town visiting relatives in another state at the time that Miriam was murdered. No way she could have done it, not possible. As we continue with the investigation, we can't find anybody else that has any motive to have this lady killed.
Then, the assassin reaches out to them.
There were these letters sent to the police station.
The first anonymous letter, right off the bat, claimed that the writer was responsible for killing Miriam Illis.
I had been involved in, probably hundreds, if not thousands, of criminal prosecutions. I'd never had a case with an anonymous letter. I mean, you see it on TV, but it's not something that really happens.
In a sensational twist, a self-professed killer writes a letter to police.
There was a lot of thoughts that go through your mind. You're thinking, is this somebody that's just making this up? Somebody that just saw the case in the news and was sending these letters out and they had nothing to do with it?
The person that claimed that they were a soldier of God, soldier of equality, soldier of death, they claimed that the victim was racist and they wanted to harvest the racist people in this town.
I remember it being very explicit about Miriam being wicked. And I believe there's certainly some racist comments that were included in the letter itself.
It didn't make any sense. There was nothing that we had that supported that accusation at all. It was just bizarre. It was very strange.
While the murderer seems to be reaching out, they've also gone to great lengths to obscure their identity.
The letters were tested for fingerprints. There weren't any.
They were handwritten in block printing in pencil.
This was in such a way that you wouldn't be able to tell how that person typically writes. So you couldn't make a comparison later at trial if you wanted to.
As investigators puzzle over the letter and its contents, another one arrives.
The second one, it had a different tone. It was indicative that the writer had a superior intellect and we didn't. It smacked of arrogance.
This second letter also points investigators towards a new suspect.
The author described himself as having advanced degrees, having many advanced degrees.
It indicated to us that possibly an associate of Dr. Illis's may be the person that did it or the person that wrote the letter.
He's talking about Dr. Zama. He was very good friends with Mrs. Illis. He and Dr. Illis were partners.
But again, Dr. Illis was the chief of cardiothoracic surgery. That may have created some friction between the two of them.
They were the two cardiothoracic surgeons for Williamsport Hospital.
The writer claimed that they were a superior intellect, that they spoke 5 different languages or several different languages, which Dr. Zama did.
Dr. Zama happened to be African American. In fact, he was probably one of the few African American people that were in the Illis's kind of inner circle of friends. He happened to be a tall guy that probably had pretty large feet, potentially size 14. He was certainly somebody that the investigators had to look at now as a result of the letters.
Dr. Zama is brought in for questioning.
The investigators actually showed the letters to Dr. Zama. They asked, who's this describing? And he indicated that it looked like the letters were describing him.
But he is adamant he played no part in Miriam's death and never wrote the letters.
Dr. Zama got along with Miriam, and they were friends.
She was the wife of a colleague, and that was as far as their relationship went.
He also claimed to have been with friends during the window of time in which Miriam was murdered.
The investigators checked out Dr. Zama's alibi for the evening of the 15th. They confirmed that he had an airtight alibi. The anonymous letters were also processed for DNA.
There was a black hair in the glued flap of the envelope that was sticking out like a sore thumb.
The DNA was tested and it didn't match Dr. Zama, but it didn't match any other of the samples of DNA collected in the case either.
The investigators now believe they're being played.
Whoever did these letters was taking all these steps to conceal their identity. They were taking the steps to make sure that they weren't using saliva to lick the glue flap or to lick the stamp. But here this large hair was predominantly placed right there in the glue flap for someone to find. It was really when that happened that I personally really started to think that there was a lot of planting of evidence going on here. A silencer with additional DNA, a cigarette butt with DNA. When it didn't match each other, it became apparent it was being planted. Now you have 4 and 5 different pieces of DNA, all from different people? Were there 5 people involved in this crime? No.
Many steps were taken to execute this plan. At the end of the day, you have to think either that he's just a psychopath or that he was really enjoying the whole process and didn't want it to stop.
The problem for troopers Holmes and Henry is that this realization puts them no closer to catching Miriam's killer.
I think we entered a time that we kind of felt like we were spinning our wheels. We were frustrated because of some of the things that had been occurring.
You want to do the right job, you want to do it correctly, you get one shot at it, and you don't want to mess up. You know, if you do, then that's the one shot you get.
Then, when a subpoena they'd been waiting for since day one is approved, it unlocks a key piece of the puzzle.
There was a handset for a telephone within close proximity to our hand.
The investigators got the phone records for Miriam.
We came to find out that there was a friend that she had been speaking to on the telephone Friday evening that had actually called her.
She indicated that she heard the sound of glass breaking during the phone call, and she heard Miriam say, "Oh my God," and then didn't hear anything else. At that time, she hung up the phone. She called back, and she got a busy signal. And then she just assumed that they had gotten cut off, and now Miriam was talking to somebody else on the phone.
This new information gives investigators something they'd been missing: an exact time of death.
The conversation ended at 10:37 p.m.
So we could tell that that call had ended the moment we believe Miriam was shot.
The time of death was everything.
Armed with the time of death of exactly 10:37 p.m., detectives recheck the alibis of all persons of interest. The only one that doesn't add up belongs to Dr. Illis.
Initially, he said that he had been in the Williamsport area, and he was already south on Route 15 by 10 p.m.
They said they stopped to get a bite at a restaurant.
If in fact he was there at around 10 o'clock, he could not have committed the crime. On the surface, it looked like it checked out, but they really couldn't verify that he was actually there at that 10 p.m. time frame.
That made his alibi look a little shaky at that point.
A well-planned or perfectly planned murder, you generally solve through the small details within the case. Small detail will include, to a great degree, timing. The timeline becomes critical in most cases, if not all cases.
Investigators break down every detail of Dr. Illis' story.
They traveled south on Route 15, and he made a call to his sister at 11:24.
He had called to tell her that they were going to have to stop and stay at a hotel.
The only real hard time they could verify was the cell phone call to his sister.
They use this information to determine the closest point Dr. Illis could have been from Miriam's house when he made the call.
We knew the route he had taken that evening because he had told us. We knew he was in a certain radius from the cell phone tower that his call came from, that his call bounced off of that cell phone tower.
Once we contacted the cell phone company and got the coverage maps,
we were able to determine approximately where that phone call was made in relation to the crime scene and in relation to the hotel.
And we found that he could have been much farther north on Route 15 than he had indicated.
The question investigators now have to answer is whether Dr. Illis could have taken the shot at 10:37, made the call to his sister at 11:24, and still made it to the hotel for 1 a.m.
We wanted to drive the route under those same conditions. We checked that night, were there any accidents that would have delayed traffic? Of course, the weather was bad. Was there a road closure? We actually even wore some sneakers that were somewhat similar to the ones that were worn that night. Went from the scene on foot, followed that dry stream bed to a vehicle, and drove to the location within the area he could have made a call from that night on his cell phone, and we found out that it was possible to do that.
Just the fact that they could recreate the timeline and it worked, it blew everyone away.
All the dots have to be connected. You have to go with what may seem to detectives initially to be something relatively trivial can become extremely important as the investigation unfolds.
Dr. Richard Illis is now the only suspect without an alibi. Next, investigators need to find a way to tie him to the murder itself.
Two young men were looking for minnows in one of our local creeks, and while doing this, they come upon a modified rifle.
They thought it looked strange, or for whatever reason, they picked it up, called the police. It's a cut-off barrel. It's a cut-off stock. It's got a scope on it. It's not something you might find every day.
The bolt from the gun had been removed and discarded. Any of the markings on the gun had been drilled out of them to hide the serial numbers. But there was a clip in the gun, so they could actually see that the caliber of that gun was a .22. This was consistent with the bullet that had murdered Miriam.
Most intriguing of all, however, is where it was found.
The partial rifle was located within close proximity to the route that Dr. Illis told us he traveled the night at the homicide.
Using the silencer recovered from the scene, they have a way to determine if this rare gun is the murder weapon.
On the top of the barrel, there was a screw that had been screwed in and added to it that would had to have been done to the gun to accept the silencer. So when you took the components of the silencer and you slid them over the barrel of the gun and turned it, it fit.
There was a stir in the crime room. You knew that this was the weapon we had been looking for.
Now the question becomes tying that gun to the perpetrator.
I was tasked with running down the particulars of the weapon. That was a Savage Model 23 rifle. Trooper Holmes made a trip down to speak to Dr. Illis's family.
He learns that Dr. Illis had inherited his father's guns, and his Aunt Jean is the only person left who knows about them.
She had brought out a photo album and was leafing through it, showing the investigators some old photos. One of the photos she flipped to was a black and white photo of her brother posing with a rifle in one hand and a dead groundhog in the other.
When he brought that photograph back, we were able to determine that that was a Savage Model 23D.
The more coincidences that pile up, the less chance that it actually is a coincidence. You can plan your murder out down to the T, but you can never rule out the fact that a fisherman walking in the Pennsylvania woods is going to step on a gun that was willed to you by your father.
We had the connection.
Investigators have recovered the weapon they believe Richard Illis used to kill his estranged wife, Miriam. The challenge now will be to secure a conviction, despite the maze of conflicting forensic evidence.
It was very frustrating for the case, because even though by this time we had our belief that, Dr. Illis may be involved, as a prosecutor, I know this is going to be an extremely difficult case to win in front of a jury, because I've got multiple pieces of DNA that don't match the accused.
You can only convict if the only logical inference that can be drawn is the person's guilt. And so if there's an alternate suspect who doesn't have an alibi, that's your reasonable doubt.
So we went back to the area where the gun was found, and we started looking and got lucky again. We found a set of shoes up there, athletic shoes.
They were determined to be the same size as the footprints from the scene. They were determined to be the same tread pattern, so they were the same shoe that was used to make the imprints.
You knew when you saw those. Those were the shoes that had taken the killer in and taken the killer out.
They must now prove the shoes were worn by Richard Illis.
We still had the issue that they're a size 14 and he wears a size 10. And of course, it would have been very possible for somebody with a size 10 shoe to wear a 14.
They are sent to the lab for forensic testing.
They found a hair on one of the tongues of one of the sneakers. They did DNA testing on that, and that came back to not match Dr. Illis.
But if the investigators are right, Dr. Illis wasn't the only person at the scene that night.
We believe that somehow he drugged his son, Richie, and he was asleep in the car.
Obviously, the son didn't have those shoes on, but transfer theory is if you leave a room or enter it, you're picking up evidence or you're leaving evidence, be it hair or fibers, anything to that effect. So there would explanation of how that hair could have got there.
We tested that against Richie Illis, Dr. Illis' son, and we got a mitochondrial match to that. The link came down to a hair from a 5-year-old.
Richard Illis planned to use false DNA to throw the police off his track. But in the end, his son's DNA links him to the murder.
You have a theory. You start with a theory in a homicide investigation or any criminal case. We had our theory in this case. And this evidence, the picture, this evidence from the sneaker, this evidence from the bullet in the magazine of the rifle. All of these things corresponded with our thoughts, our theory. They supported it. And it's physical evidence. That's powerful stuff. It doesn't lie.
As Illis is arrested for the murder of his estranged wife, investigators are left with the chilling knowledge of how he killed her.
Dr. Illis had prepared some time in advance to commit this murder. He would have had to have done that because the gun had to be modified, the silencer had to be created and fabricated, all which would have taken a substantial amount of time. He knew that if he was going to kill Miriam, he didn't want his son to be present to find her body, so it had to be on a weekend that Dr. Illis had custody of his son. This was the weekend when all those stars aligned and gave him the opportunity to commit the crime.
The plan became reality on Friday at 5 p.m. when he picked up his son from Miriam. A few hours later, the doctor returned.
Dr. Illis parked the car with Richie asleep or drugged, went through the stream bed, got up to a point where he was in position behind Miriam Illis's kitchen window. And he would have had to have waited there until Miriam would have came into the kitchen and stood in a position that gave him a shot there. If she was anywhere else in the house, he couldn't shoot her. You could only shoot her when she was in that kitchen in front of that window. And at 10:37 p.m., she was in there, was on the phone, and she presented the shot to him, and that's when he killed her. He placed the evidence there in the scene, the cigarette butt, arranged that in a position to be found, and then he would have left the scene, leaving those size 14 tracks. Then he would have gone back to the car with his son and traveled south.
He drove to the first remote place that he could get rid of evidence. He threw out the gun, he threw out the shoes, he returned to the road and continued traveling.
He made a call to his sister at 11:24. Presumably, he's doing this knowing that the records will show up and that, that can assist him in his alibi. But what it actually showed is that he could have committed the offense.
When you took this and you put it in a timeline perspective, that was key.
Richard Illis is charged with first-degree murder.
When Dr. Illis was arrested, they found an unfinished manuscript of a book. And the title of the book was Heartshot, Murder of the Doctor's Wife. And the author was Dr. Richard Illis. And it goes through and it basically documents the murder of Miriam Illis from the perspective of the killer. And the thing that I remember the most, and I'll never forget really, is that the book describes the killer's emotion at the time. And it described the killer as having an orgasmic catharsis at the time of the murder.
Despite the evidence, Illis pleads innocent to the charge. But the jury sees things differently.
After a trial in 2004, Dr. Illis was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
This is just the bad luck if you're him, or the good luck if you're the police. But without that firearm, he would not have been convicted of that crime.
Dr. Illis was an intelligent man who thought he was probably smarter than he was.
He didn't want his wife to have all his money, and he thought he could get away with it.
I don't know what it was that caused this case to get under our skin, other than that it was something that could happen to any of us. It was the life any of us could have been leading.
We had a little boy here. Very tragic. He was just a little guy who no longer had his mother, and ultimately he lost his father in this.
To do that to your son, to carry out this murder, is just beyond belief.
I heard this woman screaming, "She's dead."
A brutal killing.
This woman was controlled. She was bound, tied up for a reason.
A dark mystery with multiple suspects.
He's one of these guys that thinks he's smarter than everybody else.
They said, "If you tell anybody, I'll kill you."
The truth will be revealed.
He thought that he could get away with this.
This poor woman probably begged for her life. It just sends chills all over me.
Every day in North America, dozens of people are murdered. The key to solving the toughest of these homicides lies in the final 24 hours of the victim's life. To crack the case, detectives must reconstruct that critical timeline. The minutes and hours containing evidence that can help unlock the mystery and catch the killer. Nestled between the Indian River and the Atlantic Ocean lies the peninsula of Merritt Island, Florida.
We do have a lot of tourists that come through. It's known for water sports. The whole county is pretty much surrounded by water. A lot of boats, fishing.
But this is a very laid-back county. We're tucked away over here on the coast, and it's a beautiful, beautiful place to live.
But one hot July afternoon, the waterways reveal a grim secret.
The judge that lived on this piece of property, and he was doing yard work. He saw what he thought was a manatee. So he walked to the shoreline. And that's when he saw that it was a woman. He called the sheriff's office, and then I got the phone call.
Brevard County Sheriff's agents Jerry Harrell and Allie Roberts arrive at the scene.
We see a nude body of a female. As a homicide agent, that's not a good day.
The body's in a moderate stage of decomposition, the bloating. It hadn't purged yet, so it was probably twice the size it would normally be. She was tied with rope and some type of duct tape, and it had plastic bags tied to the body.
To catch the killer, investigators will need to unravel the last 24 hours of the victim's life.
The significance of those last movements of your victim are often critical to what happened.
Their first challenge is the woman's identity.
We knew that we had a nude white female, don't know who it is. When you have a name, at least you can do some victimology. You need to start looking at that person. What can you find out about that person? What does that person do for a living? What people are surrounded by that person? We have a fingerprint expert, one of our crime scene techs, and she fingerprints the body.
She is identified as 22-year-old Misty Morse of Indian Harbor Beach.
We find out that she lives a short distance away from there. She lives with her mother. And she grew up here. She's a local girl. Encouraging to me because usually the killer is someone that you know. That gives me a way to go, rather than being an out-of-stater or out-of-towner who was just driven here.
They look to determine how long Misty's body had been in the water.
It can make it more difficult to determine time of death. You have to take into consideration the temperature of the water and control for that. The water may accelerate the internal changes in the body and cause more decomposition at an advanced rate than it would outside the water in cooler conditions.
This is July in Florida. It's hot, the water's warm.
The heat, the insects, the animals, sometimes it's kind of hard to gauge exactly how long a person's been deceased when they're exposed to the different elements.
I'm thinking this body had been in there for several days.
As they start to develop Misty's timeline, a theory forms.
I'm thinking at that point, someone either drove in the dark of night and threw her out of a car, into the river, or she was dumped off of a boat. Looking at the body, it has some bags, like grocery store bags, tied to it. So whoever put her there weighted her down, and she was probably on the bottom for a period of time until those rocks or weights that were used busted through the bags, and then she popped up.
The physical evidence presents disturbing insight into their victims' last moments.
There was also a black rubber cord of binding. It was window spline. It's tied around her. She was bound with a piece of nylon rope. It was red and white in color.
There's tape wrapped around the head. She was controlled, she was bound, tied up for a reason. This poor woman probably begged for her life.
They must now decide how much of this harrowing detail to impart to her next of kin.
There's no way of telling somebody in a good way that their loved one is deceased or been murdered. So the best way to do it I've found over the years is to come out and tell them.
Her mother opened the door and looked at us, and it was obvious that we were detectives. And her mother said, "It's her, isn't it?" And I said, "Yeah, it's her." Her mother had seen the news coverage and told me that, Misty didn't come home, and she just feared that it was Misty. She had been expecting us. She didn't know what to do. It just sends chills all over me. Being a parent and having children Misty's age at that time, you think of your children as children. I felt so bad for her.
Misty's mother contacts her ex-husband, Bob Morse, now living on the west coast of Florida.
I answered the phone, and then I heard her screaming, "She's dead. She's been murdered." And I said, "What? Who is this? What are you talking about?" She said, "Misty, she's dead." I almost fell down. I mean, literally, I almost fell down. I said, "What happened?" She goes, "Somebody killed her. They found her in the water." I said, "Oh." There wasn't anything I could do. It just made no sense at all. The big question is why? What would drive someone to do something like that?
Misty's family provide investigators the details of her life.
Misty's mom started describing Misty, how she was named as a baby, Misty April Morse. She was born on a misty morning.
Misty was very much of a free spirit. She definitely marched to her own tune. At 22, she was just at the stage where she could, get out, go do whatever she wanted to do. I think that at that time, Misty was looking to discover herself and figure out who she was, what she wanted to do, where she wanted to be.
The focus shifts to the last time Misty was seen alive.
Misty's living in a little apartment with her mom. Her mother said that the Wednesday night before, Misty had come home from work around midnight. She said she could hear Misty on the phone talking to someone.
She talked for a few minutes, then a little bit later she received another telephone call.
Misty's mother says the first call came in at 2 a.m. and the second 20 minutes later.
She said Misty opened her door, popped in her room, spun around, asked her, "How do I look?" And Misty was very happy. Misty she said, was going out with someone that she was excited about, someone that she knew. Her mother did not know who that person was. After Misty left, she went back to sleep, got up, and went to work as usual.
Their mom tried to call her a couple times, see what was going on, when she was coming home, all that, and never got a hold of her. I had called her, but not getting a hold of her didn't surprise me. It was not unusual for Misty to take off with friends and go do whatever.
But when she didn't come home the next day, that's when she started worrying.
The details provided by the family, together with the condition of her body, help police determine a likely time of death and a lead on who was responsible.
My opinion, she was last seen early morning hours. Wednesday night going into Thursday morning, she's found on Sunday afternoon. I thought that she had been in the water soon after her mother last saw her.
In the manner in which she left the house, it's pretty obvious that she was leaving with somebody she knew. The person she left with, we were pretty confident it's the person that killed her.
Detectives believe Misty's unidentified caller may be responsible for her murder. They ask her mother for help in identifying who it could have been.
I assured her that we would be there for her and that I would follow this case through. She told me about everybody that she knew in Misty's life.
From the list she provides, one name stands out to her.
Teddy Underwood was I don't know if you'd call him a boyfriend. She met Teddy through a girlfriend of hers. Teddy's a good-looking guy.
Mr. Underwood had dated Misty for a short period of time prior to her death.
Detectives check his background and make an important discovery.
Teddy had other arrests and burglary and some type of sexual assault or battery charge.
When police find a suspect who has some sort of record for sexual assault, it definitely puts a huge flag on that person. They would determine if that person would be a likely suspect to commit murder.
That shot him right to the top of the list.
They use his criminal record to help track him down.
Teddy was a fast talker. He was the guy I had to give a lot of attention to. You're interviewing them, you want to tie them down to a story. Okay, it's not an interrogation, it's a fact-finding mission. Just to get a timeline going. And that's very important. We put him on the hot seat. But Teddy responded, he was as cool as a cucumber. And he told me, I said, hey man, I want to help you. But I know you're thinking it's probably me. He says, I understand that. I says, but it's not me. Teddy described it as a short affair. I mean, they may have hooked up a time or two. He moved on, she moved on. It was just one of those things that was short and sweet.
You're judging what they're telling you. Is it making sense? How are they acting? What's their demeanor? Are they trying to be evasive? Are they forthcoming?
Teddy says he had not seen Misty in over a week, and that he was with his friends in the early hours of Thursday morning.
Teddy had an alibi and no interest in the river or being on boats or anything like that. He was so honest and truthful. He had nothing to hide. I go by that gut feeling, and I just did not have it with Teddy.
As Teddy is cleared, they turn to Misty's autopsy for clues that may help to ID the killer.
There was no obvious bullet holes, no obvious stab wounds, but the body itself can give you clues. As an investigator, when you look at a body that's thrown in the water, that's been blindfolded and gagged, I think it's safe to assume that that person was probably alive when they went in the water. Why else would they be blindfolded and gagged? So if that's the case, drowning is a very high possibility.
There is this misperception in general that if water is found in the airway, in the lungs, and in the stomach, that means that an individual drowned. But in actuality, water can enter the body in those places passively after death. So it doesn't mean definitively that an individual died from drowning just because they have water in their lungs, they have water in their stomach.
The medical examiner just would not give us a cause of death. Now, the manner was clear. Homicide.
The examiner probes further, looking for details hidden from the naked eye.
When you're doing the autopsy, not only are you looking at the body itself, but you're looking at everything attached to the body.
There are things that may show up in microscopic examinations, and you don't know what it means until the investigation is advanced and you have more information.
When you're moving the tape from her head, there's a hair present.
It's a clue, but more work needs to be done for it to pay off.
DNA is a very helpful tool in investigating a death, but it's only helpful if you have something to compare it to.
The pathology work is now complete. Misty's father arrives and immediately provides police with a new name.
Misty was telling me about this new guy that she'd met. He was good looking and he had money and he was an ex-Navy SEAL.
She had a semi-long-term relationship with a guy by the name of Brent Huck. And he talked about how he didn't like Brent. Brent was a guy that bragged a lot, had money, and made everybody know it.
Brent Huck has this persona of being like a bad boy. And I think a lot of the girls and a lot of his friends are attracted to that type of personality.
I know that Misty liked to take chances, like most 22-year-olds. I did when I was 22. I think most of us do. We all think that we're 10 feet tall and bulletproof and gonna live forever. I remember thinking that when she was younger, we wondered if she was gonna make it past 18 because she had seemed to have a real bent for getting into trouble, associating with not good people. But we felt like, she was over that. She had been seeing Brent off and on. I said, look, you can do better than this. You don't need this guy. Get away from him, just stay away. He's bad news. Of course, as every parent on the planet knows, the fastest way to get your kid to do something is tell them not to do it.
He says, you really need to talk to Brent Huck.
Detectives track him down at his parents' house, an upscale home on Merritt Island.
Brent didn't know we're coming. We're hoping that, hey, this is gonna take us somewhere. Knocked on the door, we waited, hear a dog barking. Brent finally comes to the door.
We started talking to him about, his relationship with Misty and how it's been going. He tells us that he's known Misty for like 1.5 to 2 years, somewhere in that neighborhood. They've dated for a while. He said that she even moved in with him for a couple months.
As they talk, Agent Harrell spots something suspicious.
I noticed he had a abrasions on his knuckles and hands. And I asked him, how'd that happen? And he says, my dog was pulling me with a leash, and I was on my skateboard, and the leash burned my hands. It's not a burn, it's an abrasion. That's a crazy story.
Detectives bring him down to the station for more questioning.
If you didn't have anything to do with this, this will prove to you that you didn't. He had no problem interviewing with us.
Brent reveals to police his relationship with Misty wasn't really over.
It wasn't really a friend, it was more of a benefit, not really a friendship. It was I could go over there. I knew if I talked to her enough, I could still go over there and have sex whenever I wanted to.
He kept her on the string, so to speak.
When was the last time you slept with her? I'd say the 11th. The 11th? Yeah.
Do you want it?
Yes.
Was that at her house or your house?
Her house.
This was 9 days before Misty disappeared. Brent then admits things had recently become more complicated.
He sent some friends of his, called him, he says, hey, we saw Misty and Misty's pregnant?
Brent called to confront her the same night she disappeared.
I asked her, I was like, look, what the hell is going on? When I saw her on the 11th, I was like, you're not pregnant. Why do I keep hearing this? You really ruined my life.
Brent Huck's admission to phoning Misty the night she died has made him the latest suspect in her murder.
He told us, that he called her and bitched her out and told her to stop saying those things because he had a girlfriend.
I bitched at her, and then we settled it out. I remember calling her back 5 minutes after I talked to her and just saying, real quick, saying thanks and hanging up.
So you bitched about the pregnancy?
And you're looking at what this person is telling you. How does that fit into what you know already?
For detectives, the timing of those calls now becomes critical.
When was the last time you actually talked to her? I want to say right around 3 a.m., 3 or 4.
This is over an hour after the calls that prompted Misty to leave home.
If he puts his time frame in at 3:30 to 4 o'clock, that would have taken him out of that range.
Brent also claims he was nowhere near her house that night.
When you say you went home, you went?
Yeah, just parents' house. Oh yeah, parents' house. At that point, I was fairly intoxicated as well. It was a rough night. That's how I described it.
He had been partying pretty hard that night by the time he talked to her on the phone. It's a whole group of people. They're drinking at a couple different bars. He goes to someone's house, they're still partying.
He called another young lady to give him a ride home.
Brent says that by 4 a.m., he was in bed asleep.
And we spoke to his friends who corroborated that.
He had been dropped off by the young girl. He was at his parents' house for the rest of the night.
Despite the potential motive, his alibi seems solid.
Homicide is a 24/7 job. It's very taxing. Because when you go home, you don't take the gun belt off and throw it down and forget. The cases you're working are forever in your mind. You wake up in the middle of the night thinking about something that you need to do or should have done or should have said or should have asked.
Believing the key still lies in identifying Misty's late-night caller, they continue to probe friends and family about her relationships. This brings them to a new name, Bobby Cooper.
I guess Bobby was expecting the law to show up, and we did. We interviewed him, and the guy was all crying. I mean, the guy was upset.
You can learn a lot based on their reactions. It's not necessarily just the words. It could be they start to cry. It could be they overdo the crying. You've conducted so many interviews at this stage that you're relying on your experience to tell you whether that's a real reaction to this scenario or not.
He told me, he says, hey, I really love this girl. We had just met, and it was a whirlwind, a few days. He's very talkative, and he's answering my questions. He explained when he last saw Misty, they went to a movie, and he'd been calling her and calling her, and he says she didn't answer the phone. I thought maybe that was the end. Maybe that's just her way of ending the relationship. She just won't answer.
Bobby tells police he did finally get through, saying he spoke to Misty the night she disappeared.
I talked to her Tuesday night, and then I talked to her again on Wednesday.
You call her cell phone or what?
Yes. Yeah.
How many times Wednesday did you talk to her?
I talked to her once on Wednesday.
And that was?
7:30, between 7 and 7:30.
He told us he talked to her on the phone, and that's very important.
Bobby explains he tried her again on Thursday afternoon. When he got no response, he left several messages.
One of the things killers will do sometimes is leave messages on a victim's phone to create alibis for the murder.
We see this as an attempt by the killer to throw the police off the scent, or to throw the family off the scent of the trail, and throw the investigation in another direction.
At that moment, Bobby stuns Agent Harrell with an unsolicited admission.
Bobby said I had her driver license. That's one of the things we were looking for, we couldn't account for.
If you have the property of a dead person on you, you better have a good explanation for how you got it. Because if you don't, you're going down for that murder.
The possession of Misty Morse's driver's license puts Bobby Cooper in the spotlight for her murder.
I asked Bobby, how'd you get her license? And he says, I've had it since we went to the movie. She was wearing pants that didn't have pockets, and she just wanted me to hold on to it. He says something to the effect, well, that's one way we're guaranteed to see each other again.
I think in his mind, if he doesn't cooperate, or he gives a hint that he's not cooperating, that we're going to look at him, as a suspect.
Bobby claims he was at home with his family during the time Misty was killed.
He accounted for his time, and his dad verified that. Bobby was not our guy. Time to move on.
As a homicide agent, you have to be very patient in what you're doing. We have multiple agents interview different people, and at the end of the day, we sit down, okay, what did your guy say? What did your person say? We just review all those and try to put the pieces together as they fall.
Everybody we had interviewed, they can explain where they were or explain their relationship. We just kept moving forward.
Then, police receive a key piece of evidence they've been badly waiting for.
Misty's phone records, when we got them, told us exactly how many seconds, minutes she spoke to certain phone numbers who'd been trying to call her. The phone records is a line-by-line item. It told the story. You can see Bobby Cooper trying to call her over and over again, which corroborated what he said. And what was really important on her phone record is incoming call from Brent Huck's number, twice, just like what he said.
Brent first told detectives the calls were around 4 a.m.
But it was more like 2 o'clock, 2:20 a.m.
It was Brent Huck right back in the time frame of when the mother said of Misty that received these phone calls.
It's easy to lie using the right information, but just maybe changing the time up.
When someone's caught in a lie by police, it definitely sets them up as being a potential suspect. Because police will start questioning as to why they did this, why didn't they tell the truth in the first place, and what were the reasons behind them lying, period.
Brent had a rocky relationship with Misty. He's creating these lies, he's living a lie.
Digging into Huck's personal life, investigators discover what may be an even greater motive.
He's got this girl on Palm Beach County, his new girlfriend, who's supposedly well-connected and maybe wealthy or connected to a wealthy family.
Brent and his girlfriend were in the process of buying a house in South Florida, wedding plans. I mean, they were moving forward with their relationship. But Brent had that problem, and that was Misty back here, that he just wouldn't let go. Looking back, you're wondering if that was the catalyst for Misty saying she was pregnant to everybody, knowing that that's going to get back, hopefully, to the girlfriend.
Police decide to pay the woman a visit.
My understanding was she had no knowledge that Brent Huck was having any type of relationship with Misty. As far as she knew, she was the only female in his life at that point.
Concerned her boyfriend is involved in a homicide investigation, she agrees to cooperate.
One of the investigative techniques would be to flush someone out. To have someone call your suspect, who the suspect might be comfortable to speak to. It's just another form of getting them to speak, getting them to come out of the closet to say something.
She tells Brent that the police want to speak with her about Misty's murder.
Yeah, they're really serious about you.
I know.
Is there anything you want to tell me now before it comes out later?
There's no way about it. I'm not talking on my phone. Period.
Are you getting mad at me now?
I'm not gonna talk on the phone. If you want to get down to the bottom of this, come talk to me. God!
It's not serious.
Goodbye.
It's pretty obvious from the phone call, he's got some anger issues.
And I think he's being found out, you know, that he has this other thing on the side and all that. And of course, she wanted to know, and she wasn't happy about it. And that, I think, was a big part of understanding Brent Huck. That was my first I got you moment. I'm thinking, here we go, this is the guy.
With Brent Huck back in the spotlight, investigators revisit his main claim of innocence, his alibi.
He had told us before, he got home around 3:30 or so in the morning.
They track down Lauren, the young woman who took him home from the night's partying.
She just drove him home. She was going that way, it was no big deal.
But Lauren says she picked Huck up at 2 a.m., 2 hours earlier than the time he first claimed he was home asleep. Which means he could have driven to Misty's house soon after.
We actually asked Lauren, being the last person we know that had contact with him, did he have any injuries on his hands? No, no injuries. So it had to happen that night.
Based on this new information, investigators decide to pay Huck another visit.
Brent talked to a lawyer or two. Of course, they told him not to have any more contact. But we wrote a warrant to go back to the house to do more searching. They find a window spline in the garage. They find cell rope. They find under the sink these Publix bags.
A lot of people have spline in their house. A lot of people may have white tape at their house. A lot of people may have plastic bags at their house. What's the chances of having all three? They were able to determine that that spline came from the exact same machine as the bindings on her body, from the same factory, the same company. Same with the tape. They were able to identify the tape as the exact same tape that was found on her body, exact same company, same make, same physical characteristics, same coloring. A match. And being the last person who talked to her on the phone. So all these things are adding up. It's a lot of circumstantial, but it's all, you know, compounding against him.
But the most compelling evidence proves to be the hair found on Misty's body.
It's an animal hair. It found out to be dog hair. And Brent Huck had a dog.
The DNA really locked it in. This is the dog. It's not just the breed of dog. This is the dog.
In October 2002, Brent Huck is indicted on kidnapping and first-degree murder charges. Key to proving his guilt is the reconstructed timeline.
I think Misty got home from work. Brent was out partying. He hears the rumor that she's telling people that she's pregnant with his baby. So Mr. Huck has got to do something about this. He has Misty claiming that she's the mother of his baby, and he cannot afford to let his new girlfriend hear about this. He's got to shut her up somehow.
He ends up home probably around 2 o'clock. He's mad. He's a hothead. He's arrogant. He's spoiled.
He called her, probably under the pretense to come over to have a sexual relation that they normally have.
He drove there. He called a quick, "I'm downstairs." That explains, for the very, very short call that lasted like 10 seconds. She goes downstairs, gets in the car, off they go to his house.
The whole time I think he had it in his mind to go ahead and kill her.
He was able to incapacitate her. He got her tied up, her hands, her feet. Weighed her down with these bags filled with rocks. And took a roll of duct tape and wrapped her head. He puts her in a boat.
At this point, Misty is still alive.
I think that she struggled to get loose. She moved her head around, got the duct tape off of her mouth, begging for her life. He rolls her off the boat in the deepest part of the river. And she sinks.
I think he dumped her in the river while she was alive, knowing that she was going to die.
Despite the strong physical and circumstantial case against him, Huck pleads not guilty.
I don't want to say it's an airtight case, but we're very confident in our case. How do you explain all this? You can't. I think he thought that he could get away with this, maybe a plan in his mind how he was going to do this and how it was going to pan out, but things weren't going his way.
I remember, I think I was holding my breath, and all my muscles were clenched up. And as soon as they said guilty on both counts, I remember, thank goodness.
28-year-old Brent Huck is sentenced to life in prison.
Is it justice? I think justice would be let her daddy spend an hour with him. That would be justice.
I don't want him dead. I want him to spend the next 500 years in jail. And I want him to remember every day of his life what he did. So whatever anyone calls justice, I don't feel it. I'm just glad that he can't do it to anyone else.